Welcome back to Art Appreciation, everyone. Continuing our discussion of artistic materials and mediums, now we'll be talking about painting. And if you will allow me a little bit of shameless self-promotion real fast, painting is my favorite topic. Both my undergraduate and graduate degrees are in studio painting. So my bachelor's is in drawing and painting, and my master's degree is in painting in general. But this is something that's very dear to me. It's what I do on a daily basis and everything like that. So I do have a little bit of a bias for painting. However, if you're interested in seeing any of my work, you can check out my website at www.samswihart.com. You can also check out my Instagram at samswihartartist and everything like that. But if you're also interested in learning how to paint, during the regular semester and in fall, I teach painting 1 and 2 at TCC. So if you're interested in learning how to paint, you can go check out my work and look for my class in the fall if you're still registered and everything like that. So just a little bit of shameless self-promotion before we jump in here. So jumping in, like drawing, painting is extremely old. Drawing and painting are basically the two oldest art forms on the planet. Painting dates all the way back to the Paleolithic era, the Old Stone Age. Here we can see a nice example of very, very early painting. These are hands at Petrekar Cave in Sulawesi, Indonesia. And what I find interesting is that these hands are, they're made by taking a paint pigment and placing it in the mouth and then kind of spraying the pigment over the hand to create this silhouette, if you will. But these are dated to between 35 and 45,000 years BCE. So these are very, very old. But what I find interesting about it is it shows that these people are there and they are trying to kind of echo to us. We don't have anything else about these people that survives. Maybe a few bone fragments or something. However, we have their handprints on the wall forever here. So it's an interesting thing. And once again, I feel like painting and drawing, especially in its earliest senses, being used by early people to really try to find some kind of balance within the world that they live in and some kind of meaning within the world. But once again, I like the fact that it illustrates that these people are trying to almost reach out to us, at this distant time to say that, yes, we were there. Yes, we existed and all of these kinds of things. So I find that to be interesting. And once again, painting, like drawing, very, very old. Now, before we really get into painting wholeheartedly, we have to talk a little bit about what paint is. And so we need to talk about ingredients and surfaces. So all paint consists of 3 major ingredients. These would be the pigment, which is a finely ground powder that provides color to the paint. Then we also have a binder, and this is a sticky substance that holds pigment particles together and attaches pigments to the painting surface. And then we also have a vehicle, and this is the substance that makes the pigment or the paint liquid, and that allows it to be thinned and everything like that. Now, depending on what type of paint we're using, our binder and our vehicle might be dramatically different, but all paint is still going to use some form of pigment. So that's where we begin with pigment. And there are many different kinds of pigment. They come from a variety of different sources, both natural and synthetic. Nowadays, a lot of pigments have synthetic, qualities, or, they're made from synthetic substances. If you ever, go and buy a tube of paint at Michael's or Hobby Lobby, if it says hue next to it, next to the color, that means it's a synthetic pigment. And this is largely, a response to many natural pigments being fairly toxic. So things like lead have been used in the past. Cobalt is used to make pigments like blue, and very, very toxic material. But these pigments come from all kinds of different sources. For instance, in the past, crushed up insects have been used for various reds, things like that. There are all kinds of different plant materials that can be used for a variety of different pigments, both greens and other colors. Indigo comes from the flower of a specific plant, things like that. But some of them are kind of nasty. Some of them are very natural. A lot of earth colors come from things like clay, whereas, in the past there was a famous color known as Indian yellow, which was actually made by feeding mango leaves to sacred cows in India. They would then collect the urine from those cows, dry it into crystalline form, and then use that to make this very deep, rich yellow pigment. And it sounds kind of disgusting, but once again, this is something that was used quite extensively in the past, and not only in India, but also in European paintings in the Baroque period and the 19th century onward, etc., etc. Now, I'd like to show this image because it's an interesting thing and a rather unfortunate thing, but it shows just what kind of materials have been used for pigment and paint making. So this is a tube of what's known as mummy brown, and this is a brown paint that's literally made from the crushed up remains of Egyptian mummies. And in fact, the company that made this in London only stopped making it in the 1960s when they ran out of mummies to crush and grind into paint. And this is very unfortunate that this happened, but once again, it just shows that we can use a whole variety of different things to create paint pigments. Now, aside from pigments, we need some kind of binder. And so one of the major binders that's used is linseed oil. This is the major binder in oil paint and things like that, oil pastels. But it's made from pressing flax seed. So here we can see some flax seed and then the linseed oil made from that. Now we can also use a variety of other kinds of oils. Walnut oil is used quite a bit. There are also various stand oils made from different plant materials and things like that. But another major binder that we have is what's known as gum arabic, and this is the sap of the acacia tree. And this is what's used to bind things like colored pencils, watercolor, gouache, pastels. Chalk is usually bound with gum arabic as well. But here we can see it in its raw crystalline form. This would then be melted down and mixed in with a pigment to create the binding agent. Now, aside from that, something else that was used quite extensively in the past was egg yolk. And this was used almost exclusively in what's known as egg tempera. So this was the original form of tempera paint, not to be confused with that really crummy, craft paint that they use in like elementary school. That's actually bound with a form of milk protein and things like that. So, but we can use egg yolks to bind our paint as well. And so this is something that was done in the past, but it's fairly temperamental, and we'll get into that here in a little bit as well. Now, aside from that, we also have to have a vehicle. Most vehicles are going to be things like water, turpentine, other substances like that. In oil painting, we can also use various other oils as a vehicle to help thin our paint, create, more flexibility and spreadability while maintaining its binding capacity and things like that. Now, once we have our paint made, though, once we have our paint selected, we also have to have something to paint on. And that something is referred to as the support, or the structure which holds the painting. And there are a variety of different kinds of supports that have been used throughout the past and into the contemporary world as well. So we have things like wood panels, stretched canvas has been used, paper, metal, plaster in the case of wall painting and fresco painting, but we can even paint on glass if we want. Francisco Goya and many other artists have done interesting paintings on obsidian glass, black volcanic glass. So once again, depending on what type of support we have, we're going to have various different kinds of ways of looking at the paint or the painting. It's going to come off and read to us as the viewer in different ways as well. Now, aside from the support, we usually have to prepare our support to receive our paint before we can really, get going. And in the past, one of the first things that we would do is size our support. And by that, we mean, by size, we mean a sealant that is used to lessen the absorptive qualities of the support. And this is important, especially in things like wood panel and canvas painting, because those materials can absorb the oil paint if we don't seal them first. And oil paint in particular is very acidic, and so it can eventually eat away at those materials over time. So here we can see what the traditional size was in the past, and this is what's known as rabbit skin glue. And so this is a natural hide glue, but it's fairly problematic in that it remains water soluble and susceptible to humidity. So if you've ever seen an old painting that had a lot of cracks in it, such as what we see here, this is largely due to rabbit skin glue, because that sealant underneath the paint layer, remains susceptible to humidity and water reabsorption, which swells it, and it then swells the brittle paint film on top, thus resulting in cracks. And sometimes this can result in paint loss and all kinds of things like that. So if you've ever wondered why a painting was cracked, if you've been to a museum or something, most likely it's because of rabbit skin glue. Now, once we've sized our canvas, once we've sealed it, artists will usually use a primer, or sometimes referred to as gesso, on top of this sizing layer. And this is a substance that is applied over the size on top of the surface to provide a bright white and uniform surface. And so here we can see it's usually just brushed on, but it creates that whiteness of the canvas. But what I find interesting, and many artists in the past especially have used this, and I use it myself, it's a technique called an imprimatura, and this is when a stain is either added to the gesso to color it or applied on top to kind of get rid of the stark white quality of a canvas. And there's a phenomenon similar to writer's block that they call blank canvas syndrome, and that stark white canvas can be very overwhelming and intimidating to start on. So just tinting it with a color or adding a light color kind of wash over the top can really help us kind of break away from that. And it can also help in the later painting as well, in that it can provide contrasting tone and all kinds of things like that that can enhance the overall visual effect of the painting that comes later on. Now, aside from that, we can start to talk about various kinds of paint. So once we've had we've gotten our support chosen, we've got it all, primed and ready, then we can go about painting. And so our most basic form of paint, and all of the first several paints that we're going to talk about have all been known since ancient times. It's not until we get to oil paint, which is derived in the Renaissance, that we start to have more contemporary kinds of paint. But watercolor is one of the most basic forms of paint. It's when a pigment is mixed with water and gum arabic, and then used in a kind of wash manner similar to ink wash. But I'm sure most of us have used watercolor at some point. It's definitely used in school quite a bit, elementary school and things like that. But so here we can see a typical watercolor kind of palette that we might be familiar with. However, watercolor is an interesting technique in that, unlike all the other painting techniques, it's actually completely reversed. So in watercolor, we actually have to paint from light to dark, whereas in every other painting form, we go from dark to light. So watercolor in that regard is a staining technique. So we actually gradually go through and stain the surface of our white paper, and we allow the white of the paper to be the white within the image. So we would have to use things like blocking fluid most of the time, which is a kind of latex that keeps the watercolor from getting on certain parts. But we can see as we go here and here and here, we would gradually layer up these thin translucent films of watercolor to create an overall realistic feel. Now, something that's important to note, and we touched on this a little bit last time, is that for most of its history, watercolor was used as a study material. So it wasn't used for finished products or finished paintings. Instead, artists would use it in the field along with drawing to, you know, render ideas quickly. So here we see an example by Eugene Delacroix. We have several study sketches of camels, but he's used watercolor to kind of render the color that he saw in person up here. And once again, we have to remember this is a time before photography, so you know, without doing the watercolor there, he would only have black and white sketches. But this is also a time before paint is available in tubes, so artists actually had to make their own paint until roughly the 1850s, 1860s, when tube paint came out. So Delacroix is definitely in that regard. He did not have oil paint that he could take out into the field with him. Instead, he's using watercolor to kind of accurately and descriptively render how color would look as he's looking at the scene in front of him. He would then use this as reference material in his studio to finish a painting in oil in full color and everything like that. Now, once again, here we have just another example of a watercolor that's being used more of a study, but we can see just kind of what quality we can get with watercolor. Now, it's important to note that this is also making use of what was known at the time as body color, or what we call today gouache, and we'll talk about gouache here in a second. But this is by Albrecht Dürer, a very famous German artist from the 1500s. But here we can see, you know, a wing of a tropical parrot, which is very accurately rendered in watercolor with little bits of that gouache thrown in to give it a bit of opacity so that it's, you know, sits on the surface instead of looking more like a stain and things like that. But once again, we can do some remarkable things with this so long as we're able to have the patience. Now, aside from doing study works like this, one of the other major uses for watercolor in the past was to hand color black and white prints. So a print such as the one we see here is something that, you know, we can pull, you know, thousands of them at once off of one, you know, kind of plate that the artist creates, and they're all identical. However, in the past, before colored ink and stuff like that was developed, all, you know, printmaking would have just been the black and white line work that we see, and then someone would have sat there and painstakingly hand colored in the image that we see with watercolor. So they would have done this in, you know, limited editions and things like that. But it's just one other use aside from studies that watercolor would have been used for in the past. Now, nowadays, however, we can do watercolor more as finished works of art in and of themselves. Now, that is, it's still fairly rare though, because a lot of artists are not using watercolor for finished works of art. They're still using them for studies. It's usually used, you know, once again as a teaching tool for students much more than it is by professional artists. But one such artist that makes a really heavy use of watercolor in his work, and one of my personal favorite artists, is Andrew Wyeth. And he's also a multimedia artist. He uses oil paint. He's also did the painting Christina's World that we saw a while back. But here we can see a nice watercolor by him and everything like that. And so once again, we can have very realistic kinds of looks to it, but it does have a certain kind of characteristic to it. It's always going to have this kind of washy look to it and be a little bit less, you know, kind of refined as oil paint might be. But, you know, Andrew Wyeth's, his watercolors are really interesting to look at. Once again, you can go, you know, look him up in your free time, but I really like the quality of his work. Now, aside from watercolor, we also have gouache, and gouache is an opaque form of watercolor that has chalk added to the pigment. And once again, not a lot of artists are going to be using gouache for finished works of art. It's going to be used much more as a study material or for smaller, lesser works. But one artist that makes extensive use of gouache is Honore Daumier. And he's very famous for doing these kinds of illustrations of, you know, French society in the middle of the 19th century. So here we see the Palace of Justice. But this is also done in conjunction with watercolor. But we can see that unlike our watercolor, the gouache is being used to have this kind of opaque feeling, especially on the kind of highlight portions here and there within the image itself. So it's a little hard to distinguish most of the time from watercolor because it has a very similar look to it. excuse me, but it does have a nice kind of opaque quality to it. But here we can see just another example of a gouache painting. This one is almost exclusively gouache. I think it has a little bit of watercolor in it, but we can see once again that gouache has a little bit more of a solid body to it than the kind of wishy-washy quality of watercolor. But once again, gouache, like watercolor and like in this instance, is used much more for its spontaneity, its quickness, as a study kind of material. So we're doing, you know, a scene like this from life in person, and then we take it back to the studio and do a fully color, you know, oil painting or something like that. So once again, most artists are not going to use gouache as finished works of art in and of themselves. It's always usually going to be intended for reference material later on. But here we can see just another example of a nice gouache painting, this time by Winslow Homer, famous American Western artist. But we can see perhaps that quality of opaqueness in it, down here, especially on the kind of sand and gravel in the base down here. So we can see it has a kind of more of a physical body-like presence to it. Now, aside from gouache, we can also use ink painting, and this is a kind of watercolor technique that utilizes ink washes in a similar fashion to watercolor through the building up of transparent layers. Now, it is important to note that ink painting is more heavily utilized in Asia, and we touched on this a little bit last time because in Europe, ink painting or ink wash drawing is much more of a drawing type of you know, technique or material. So you know, here we can see an ink painting by Tipiello, famous you know, kind of Italian 18th century artist. But once again, he's using the ink wash to create the idea of where light and shadow is going to be, and this would be a reference for a later work of art done in oil and everything like that. However, once again, in Asia, ink painting is pretty much the most predominant technique that's used. And so here we can see a nice example coming out of 14th century China. This is Dai Jin's landscape in the style of Yan Wingyi. And so this is harkening back to an earlier master, but what I find interesting about Chinese ink painting in particular is that it's meant to echo calligraphy. So there's usually calligraphy in association with it, but it's meant to echo the poetic qualities of calligraphy. So all of the kind of intuitive nature of the calligraphy brushstroke, but it's also meant to echo the whole idea of poetry and harmony within nature. So many Asian ink paintings are really heavily focused on these poetic and harmonious qualities of nature, and the human presence is much more subdued, if it's even visible at all. So really nice idea, but they also really make nice use of ink wash and negative space within these kinds of works to echo certain atmospheric qualities and everything like that. And we'll talk more about this when we get to Asia a little later on as well. But I do like to show another example, this time coming out of China a little bit later on, as this kind of whole idea of the poetry of calligraphy and the brushstroke of calligraphy begins to echo into ink painting much more heavily. We start to get works like this that become a little bit more abstract, but they're really echoing that idea of the calligraphy stroke. So if we can see the calligraphy of Bada Shanran over here on the side, we can see that mimicked in some of the major forms of these two birds in this little landscape setting here as well. This also gets into a heavy amount of Zen Buddhism and other things like that. And once again, this kind of harmonious quality in nature. But I like to think of works like this as being very much like that drawing by Brancusi that we saw, in that to be this descriptive and this accurate while being so simple at the same time takes a whole different level of mastery than, say, rendering a subject completely realistic. Once again, it's a different skill set, a different practice level, and everything like that. But we can see that echo not only in Chinese ink painting, but also Japanese ink painting. painting, such as we see here, but once again, really echoing that kind of poetic quality of the calligraphy brushstroke and the kind of spontaneity of it. So, you know, this painting, Splashed Ink Landscape by Haboku Sansu, is, you know, done very, very quickly. It's really only a couple slaps of the paintbrush on the paper there, but to do something so descriptively accurate yet so simple, once again, whole different level of mastery there. And once again, we'll talk more about these ink paintings when we get to Asia a little bit later on. Now, aside from that, we also have fresco painting, and this is perhaps the oldest art, painting form, in that technically paintings done on a cave wall are considered to be a fresco, but they are, a fresco refers to any wall or mural painting, but there are different kinds of fresco, and we'll see that. But here we can see a nice surviving example of ancient fresco work coming from ancient Rome. In fact, the majority of ancient frescoes that still survive to us today actually come from the Roman city of Pompeii, which was buried by the explosion of Mount Vesuvius in 79 BC. And so, it really gives us a nice insight into not only that historical period, but, what daily life was like, what their art was like, because I find it interesting that in ancient Greco-Roman times, painters were actually more well-known than sculptors. Unfortunately, though, most ancient Greco-Roman painting doesn't survive to this day. It's the sculpture that survives, and so that's what we tend to think about them being more involved with, even though that's not necessarily the case. Now, so our first type of fresco is what's known as a Buon fresco, or a true fresco. And so this is where a water-based pigment is suspended into damp lime-based plaster. So the important distinction is that Buon fresco is done in damp plaster, okay? So this is an important distinction. But if we will, I'll show you a little bit of a breakdown of the process. So if we remember from last time, we have our cartoon. So Michelangelo, in this case, draws the figure of God in the full-scale cartoon. And his assistants then go along and they poke little holes along the line work. And then from there, they will hold that up to the wet plaster that they laid down, and they tamp the edge of the line work with a bag full of powdered charcoal. And so when they remove the cartoon, what they're left with is something like this. And so we see that line work echoed on that wet plaster as well. Now it's important to note that when we're doing Buon fresco, that because plaster dries fairly quickly, we can only do sections of the painting at a time. So we have to do small sections at a time. It all has to be done in that moment while it's wet. And then once the plaster dries, that paint becomes part of that plaster forever, and it becomes part of the wall forever. So it's a very permanent kind of technique. But if we look here, we can see Charlton Heston as Michelangelo there. But we can see how the artists would have gone about doing this, and how the Sistine Chapel ceiling would have gone about being painted. And it's important to note that Michelangelo worked on that painting for a period of 4 years. And it's all through doing these small sections. So his assistants would come in and lay plaster in one section. They would then transfer the drawing, and then the master would come in and paint in that section. They would then go through and paint in between the figures here and there and all of that as well, until we get the final product. So it's a very time-consuming, very laborious kind of a practice, but it can still do some remarkable things. And once again, we have to be very quick in this painting, because artists are usually using egg tempera in this, which dries very quickly, and then also the plaster dries very quickly. So usually artists will do the brunt of the work in this Buon fresco technique. However, they might do some finishing work a little later in what's known as fresco secco. And so this is our second major form of fresco painting. And this refers to dry fresco, in which egg tempera is applied to dry plaster or over an already dry Buon fresco. So if this is the Buon fresco, the artist might, very, very quickly get in all of the basic information, but then they might use fresco secco to apply small details or in paint between the figures, all of these kinds of things. However, this, So this method has often been used for things like retouches and details and all that kind of stuff. But we can do a fresco secco just as is. So most mural paintings nowadays, where we're painting with acrylic on a wall, would technically be a fresco secco. However, one of the most well-known examples of a fresco secco is actually The Last Supper by Da Vinci, and it's actually part of the reason why it doesn't look as good as it would have originally, because Da Vinci's actually experimenting quite a bit in this. So he's actually utilizing not only tempera paint, so egg tempera, but he's also using oil paint in this as well. So he's kind of experimenting with using both of these mediums together, and as a result, a lot of the paint over time is flaked off the wall, and so the painting is not in as good of a condition as it would have been originally. So unfortunately, for us, we don't really get to see what its original vibrance would have looked like. But it is interesting to think of, Da Vinci experimenting with new materials and new techniques and all of these kinds of things as well. But once again, this is probably the most well-known example of a fresco secco. But there are other forms. Most Egyptian painting, tomb paintings and things like that are also considered fresco seccos. So here we can see a nice detail from the tomb of Nebumun once again. But here we can see another attribute of ancient Egyptian life. So this is musicians. So we have female musicians here that are all playing various instruments. But what I find interesting about this depiction is an aspect of ancient Egyptian lifestyle, in that almost all ancient Egyptian people, regardless of gender, actually would have shaved heads and they would wear wigs. So we can see, all of these women are wearing these very elaborate wigs, and on top of their wigs, they would place a honeycomb, and that honeycomb would melt throughout the day, and it would release perfumes into the wig. So it would kind of act as a way of, making pleasant scents and things like that. But it's kind of an interesting aspect. But once again, this is a fresco secco. It's painted directly onto the limestone within the tomb wall itself. Now, aside from that, we also have, once again, more modern examples of fresco secco. Here we can see one of the more prominent examples from the modern period, and this is by the Mexican artist Diego Rivera. But this is his mural of Detroit industry. So he goes to Detroit and does this for this mural of auto workers and things like that. Diego Rivera does a lot of these kind of massive, grandiose murals. Many of his in Mexico, which we'll see a little later on as well, deal with like Mexican history and all of that kind of stuff. But he's also a rather, kind of socialist persona. He's, was a member of the Communist Party and all that. So a lot of his work extols the virtue of, working people and labor and all of that. But this would also be considered a fresco secco because it's oil paint done directly onto a dry wall as opposed to into that wet plaster again. So now, aside from fresco painting, one of our other most ancient forms of painting is encaustic painting. And this is a very interesting form of painting. It's when painting or a painting medium is, or in which pigments are suspended in hot beeswax. So we would actually take our pigment and mix it into beeswax as opposed to, say, oil or egg yolks or whatnot. So a different type of binder that we can use. However, the most well-known examples of encaustic painting actually come from the Greco-Egyptian period. So this is a period when Greece ruled over Egypt after the death of Alexander the Great, before the rise of the Roman Empire. And so what they would do are, these encaustic paintings that we know of from this period are what are known as the Fayum mummy portraits. And these are very interesting in that an individual would actually go and they would have their portrait made at their kind of prime of life and their youth, all of these kinds of things, and they would set it aside, and then this portrait would actually be wrapped up over the face in a mummy bandaging, once the individual died and was embalmed. And so it gives us an insight into how these people actually looked, and especially considering this coming out of the ancient Egyptian aesthetic where everything is very heavily idealized, so no one actually looks like they would have in real life. We actually get a sense of who these people were remember what they actually looked like while alive and everything like that. So it gives us an interesting insight, I feel. But what's also remarkable about this is completely created out of nothing but beeswax. And so, in order to get this blending and everything so smoothly, they're having to use torches or like hot metal instruments and everything like that. And it's very difficult because this encaustic paint, it dries that fast, literally. I've used it in modern times, and you have to use a heat gun and other things to try to blend it, and it's very unpredictable and it's very challenging to use. So the fact that ancient people using nothing but like fire are able to achieve this kind of quality in it is quite remarkable. But what's also interesting about these Fayum mummy portraits, it's not just men, it's women and children as well. But they give us an insight into not only how people looked, but also fashion and jewelry and everything like that, such as this particular portrait of a affluent woman. So we can see, all of her fine jewelry. We get a sense of what hairstyles were like, all of these kinds of things. But likewise, we even have, portraits of children. And, unfortunately, in the past, death was not as merciful and everything. It was much more common for people to die young and everything like that. But it's still an interesting quality in that we get a sense for who these particular individuals were, especially considering the fact that they're embalmed mummies and everything don't really give us a sense of what they would have actually looked like in life. So I've always found these to be remarkable. But I do want to show one more, kind of more recent example of encaustic painting. Encaustic is fairly rare. Not many artists use it outside of ancient times. However, one of the greatest examples of this would be by Paul Delaroche, who we saw a little bit earlier. And this is from the Hermesile at the École des Beaux-Arts, and this is the major French art academy in Paris. But what we see here, I have to show you in 3 separate images because it's too large to show in one. But it's the great masters of the past receiving their laurel wreaths and this kind of symbol of mastery, if you will. But this entire painting is made out of nothing but beeswax with pigment suspended in it. But if we go through it, we can pick out a few prominent individuals. So, for instance, right here in the center, we see Dante Alighieri, the writer of the Divine Comedy or Dante's Inferno. We can see his guide in that book, the Roman poet Virgil, who's responsible for writing the Aeneid and other major mythological works. But if we move over, we can see this figure is meant to be Da Vinci. Just behind him, we can see Albrecht Dürer, who painted that wing that we saw a little bit earlier on. And then, if we move through it, so that was the left side of the painting. If we move into the center of the painting, we can see here, these are 3 figures that are meant to represent the architects of the Pantheon in Rome, as well as the Parthenon in Greece. So these are kind of traditional, masters as seen. And then we can see them surrounded by the muses. So these are the kind of Greco-Roman deities responsible with creativity and, inspiration and all that. And we can see this other allegorical figure distributing laurel wreaths. And so in the past, the laurel wreath was seen as a symbol of, artistic mastery and all of these kinds of things. But if we then move into the right side of the panel, we can also see a few other, major masters. We could go through and, reference every single one of these guys. But just another prominent individual. I believe this is meant to be Duccio. We also have Titian right here in red. Just behind him, we have a famous Spanish painter named Murillo and another famous Spanish painter known as Diego Velázquez back here in the corner. I believe one of these figures is meant to be Raphael as well. But once again, we could go through and pick everyone out. But I like this painting because it is probably the greatest example of an encaustic painting ever made. And, I'm just kind of blown away by the fact that it's made out of wax and it's so realistic and accurate and everything like that. Now, aside from encaustic, we also have what's known as tempera paint, and this is a paint in which a pigment is bound with egg yolk and then thinned with water. And so this is once again opposed to the tempera paint from like elementary school, which is water based with like a protein binder and everything. But egg tempera has been known since ancient times. A lot of the paint that was used in ancient Egypt and ancient Greece and Rome was all egg tempera as well. So once again, very, very common type of paint. However, egg tempera has certain limitations to it because egg tempera, like encaustic, dries almost instantly. So it has to be applied through thin glazes. So artists are actually going to, layer up these thin transparent glazes of color to create a finished product instead of trying to interblend colors together like we might with oil paint or something like that. So it tends to have a kind of sculptural-esque look to it. It tends to be a little on the kind of flat side, but also many times it's also done in association with a certain aesthetic trend. So here we can see a nice example of an egg tempera painting on wood panel by Duccio. And once again, we have the Virgin and Child. We know it's the Virgin and Child because she's wearing red and blue. But we can see that it has a kind of flatness to it. This is also owing to this Byzantine aesthetic where artists are not trying to recapture reality within a work of art because it would be considered to be in competition with the divine and everything like that. But it has this kind of sculptural form to it, if you will. Now, other artists also, over time as, aesthetic trends begin to relax, they also start to use tempera a little bit more like oil paint, and they begin to, figure out how to use it more realistically, such as in Sandro Botticelli's The Birth of Venus here. And we'll talk a little bit more about this painting later on as well, but we can perhaps see that it still has this kind of sculptural, almost waxy-like feeling to it. It definitely doesn't feel as realistic as oil paint is able to achieve, because once again, all of this is done through really subtle, thin, transparent layers of paint. So this particular painting probably has, I don't know, like 80, 90 layers of paint on it just to get up to this quality. And so once again, very time consuming, very laborious kind of practice. But once again, many artists use this until the end of the Renaissance when tempera paint begins to fall out of favor in favor of oil paint. But here we can see just another example by Michelangelo. Almost all of his artwork is done exclusively in tempera paint. The Sistine ceiling works like this. The Holy Family here. So we have the Virgin Mary, once again, red and blue. We also have the Infant Jesus and Joseph in the background there. But once again, we can see it has a very crisp kind of quality to it. It's definitely much more sculptural, much less soft than, say, oil paint is capable of achieving. And that's because, once again, it's very difficult to blend with tempera paint. This is almost all done through transparent, thin layers of glaze. Now, that brings us to oil paint itself. And so this is, everything we talked about prior to oil paint has been known since ancient times, has been used since ancient times. But so oil paint is the first kind of newer painting medium that we come to. So oil paint is a form of paint where a pigment is mixed with various vegetable oils. And it's important to note, as I mentioned before, about the 1850s, 1860s, all artists had to make their own paint from scratch. And this is how it would go about being done. So this is what's known as mulling. And so we would use this glass muller and we would grind the pigment down and then we would grind it into the oil as well. And what's interesting about making your paint this way by scratch is that you can make it at the consistency that you want it to be. So you can make it very liquidy, or you can make it very, thick and, heavy bodied, such as we see here. So you actually have a lot more control over it than, paint nowadays that comes out of the tube, where you gotta, do a lot to it depending on, what kind of quality you want with it. But what's interesting about oil paint is it's very versatile. And that, we can make oil paint dry within 24 hours, or we can, make it stay wet for 6 months. So we can really sit there and get nitpicky and meticulous in, how much we blend and how realistic we can get. However, The first artist in Europe to really be known for using oil paint, he's widely considered to be the originator of oil paint, is this individual. And this is thought to be a self-portrait of Jan van Eyck. So he is coming out of the region of Northern Europe known as Flanders or modern-day Belgium. And all of this, but we can see that compared to, say, those temper paintings that we saw a few minutes ago, this has a much more naturalistic, soft kind of quality to it. And that's once again because oil paint can stay wet forever, and we can just sit there and manipulate it as much as we want to get all kinds of different effects. And so this really makes oil painting much, much more versatile and much easier to use, and we can create a whole huge amount of effects with it. That basically anything is possible with oil paint, whereas many of our other painting forms have a lot of limitations to them. So here we can see probably one of Van Eyck's more famous works, and we'll talk more about this one again a little bit later on as well. But we can see just what kind of level of quality we can achieve with oil paint. And something I find interesting and that is that early on here, oil paint is usually done in a way that's very similar to tempera painting. So it's actually done through the layering up of these transparent layers of thin, oil paint. And what's interesting is that these thin transparent layers of oil paint actually allow light to penetrate them, and so they retain their luminous quality. And so if you ever see an old master painting in the gallery or in a museum, they tend to have this kind of glowing effect to them because the oil paint allows light to penetrate the surface and then reflect back off of the whiteness of the canvas. And so they have this kind of glowing look to them sometimes. But once again, and this is just a nice example, we can get all different kinds of effects. So we get the idea of like the fur trim, and it looks like fur trim, on their clothing here. We get the sense of like that kind of milkiness of their skin and everything like this. But then even, the little details in wood and all of this kind of stuff can all be registered in oil paint. And so when we're doing oil painting, and once again tempera as well, we can talk about a little bit of a technique associated with these. So we have glaze or glazing, and this is when a very thin transparent film of color is applied over a previously painted surface. And glazes are applied from dark to light and from transparent to opaque, or vice versa, depending on the desired effect to be achieved. So glazes give rich depth to a painting surface, allowing light to penetrate and reflect off that ground, as we've mentioned. But glazing is done not only in oil painting, but also in tempera painting quite extensively. So here we can see, I'll show a few kind of pictures of the glazing process. So many artists, this is a person making a copy of The Girl with the Pearl Earring by Johannes Vermeer. But we can see how many artists would go about this. So they would actually start off by rendering their subject in black and white, what's known as a grisaille, and then they would begin to, very thinly glaze up their color over top. And they would start with their darkest color and work their way up to light. So, they would cover the entire surface, with that dark haze, and then we can see he's starting to come in with lighter tones and overpaint in those lighter areas. And so we would, kind of keep doing this until, we would get the desired effect. And Johannes Vermeer is a master of this glazing technique. His paintings have at least 60 plus layers on them each. So very, very time consuming, very laborious, but it can achieve these really remarkable results that have this very brilliant kind of quality once again when that light radiates out of it and everything like that. So very, very interesting. I use many of these same techniques myself. It's something that's kind of starting to have a little bit of a resurgence nowadays as well. Now, glazing is opposed to, say, scumbling, and we mentioned scumbling a little bit earlier when we talked about Titian during our evaluating art lecture, but scumbling refers to a technique similar to glazing in which an opaque paint is thinly scrubbed over a surface to create a translucent film of color. So the important difference here is that a glaze is usually softly brushed and it's completely transparent, whereas a scumble is kind of scrubbed on and has this kind of hazy quality to it, or a translucent quality. So glaze is transparent, scumble translucent. That's the major difference. But many artists in the Baroque period, when canvas starts to be heavily used, make really great use of scumbling, and scumbling really works very well for skin tone and things like that, skin texture as well. And it's also really well suited to canvas painting, because canvas has a rougher texture to it than, say, a wood panel, which is usually more well suited to glazing. But here we can see a nice example. This is Diego Velázquez's Las Meninas, and we'll talk a little bit more about this later on as well. But if we look at a close-up of the Infanta of Spain here in the center, we can see that scumbling quality. So the skin on her has been, kind of roughly scrubbed over the top to create this kind of subtle, hazy-like effect. And so up close, it looks a little bit, unrealistic and everything. But when we go back, it has this very realistic quality. So it's a kind of an illusionistic technique, but it's an interesting technique as well. So what we're basically talking about with glazing and scumbling and everything like that refers to what's known as the indirect painting technique. And so this is a process whereby a painting is created through the building up of glazing and scumbled layers. So this is how most finished artworks from the past are created until roughly the middle of the 19th century. It continues, and people, still do it today. I use glazing and scumbling all the time. But starting in the middle of the 19th century, we also start to see that direct painting becomes more prominent. So a direct painting refers to when paint is applied wet on wet and completed in one sitting, or maybe one or two sittings. When it's done in one sitting, it's usually referred to as alla prima. And now that doesn't mean that direct painting isn't, present in the past. It's usually used as a study form, kind of like watercolor. We might go out and do a very quick painting directly in one sitting to use as a color reference for our later painting that's done with the full, 80 glazes and everything like that. So they usually go hand in hand, but starting in the mid 19th century, we start to have painters that use direct painting exclusively. And so we'll see some examples. So here we can see a breakdown of the indirect method, and this is a copy of that portrait of Louis Bertin by Ingres that we saw earlier on. But we can see, here we can see our grisaille. So we have our kind of black and white, image. This time it's being used with more earth tones to create the warmth of the feeling within it. But then we can see, as the artist, copying this image begins to glaze and scumble up those colors, they're glazing the shadows and they're scumbling the highlights across the face. And you gradually get more and more detailed and add details and things like that. So once again, this is a kind of simple breakdown of that indirect method. It could go and be much more complicated and laborious than this in many cases. However, this is a nice simple rundown of it. However, direct painting is once again when we do a painting all in one sitting. And so here we have a nice example of a direct painting and how direct painting was used in the past. So we might remember this altarpiece by Peter Paul Rubens, The Elevation of the Cross, from last time, or two lectures ago. But this is Rubens' study that he did to inform the larger finished work. So this is a painting that would have been done in basically one or two sittings, and it would have served as a model for the final painting that would have been done indirectly through glazes and scumbles and things like that. So once again, many artists in the past used direct painting as a kind of extension of drawing, if you will, before going on to the larger indirect painting. However, once again, starting in the 19th century, we start to have more artists using direct painting wholeheartedly and exclusively. And so this usually goes hand in hand with what comes to be known as painterly style, which refers to, anytime you hear me or anyone say painterly, it refers to loose, unrefined brushwork. And so, once again, this is used very extensively in wet on wet. So we're not trying to, use glazes to remove all brushstrokes from the work and be illusionistic. Instead, we're trying to let that brushwork kind of register and add to the sensibility of the work. So here we can see a nice example of one of the first artists to really take on this painterly quality, and that is Eugene Delacroix. And we can see this is the lion hunt. But if we look at a close-up of the lion here, we can see that painterly quality, and that, the individual hairs of the lion, it's just single brush strokes, almost like Van Gogh, but it very masterfully echoes the reality of the image itself. And so once again, the Impressionists look at work like this, and they are inspired to start to look at how the human eye sees and interprets information based on this kind of approach. And this is opposed to, say, if we look at this kind of direct painterly style versus, say, Jean-Leon Gérôme, who's using like tons of glazing and scumbling. In this, we can't even see a single brushstroke in this particular work of art. It's all very, very smooth and seamless, as opposed to, say, all of this really nice kind of, flicking of the wrist and things that go into that. So once again, there's a big difference there. Now, that brings us to one of our newest painting forms, and that is acrylic paint. And so this is a medium developed in the 1950s where a pigment is mixed with an acrylic polymer, a synthetic resin that provides a fast-drying, flexible film that can be thinned with water. Acrylic paint can be applied to a wide variety of surfaces, primed or not. So we can actually use acrylic paint without using a gesso or a size layer. In fact, a lot of gesso nowadays is acrylic based and things like that. But the paint also rarely darkens with age like oil paint does, although its longevity has still been yet to be tested because of its relative newness. So we know for a fact that encaustic or tempera or oil can last for hundreds if not thousands of years. However, acrylic paint being plastic based, it's really not known what it's going to do in the long run, because the oldest acrylic paintings are only about 60 years old. And so plastic tends to get brittle and crack and everything like that. So it's just not really known what it's going to do in the long run. So not a lot of professional artists really use acrylic for that reason. It's usually used much more by students. Its fast-drying nature, like tempera, also makes it very difficult to use. So when we want to do something realistic with it, we have to use it in a style very much reminiscent of tempera, where we're layering up transparent layers, or we have to add certain, additives to it to make it slower drying, and all kinds of things like that. Now, we can do remarkable things with acrylic. It's just way more difficult than oil paint. So acrylic paint usually lends itself to much more flat, much more basic kinds of representations. Here we can see one of the more prominent, famous artists to use acrylic paint. This is the English pop artist David Hockney. But in his painting The Big Splash, we can see that, acrylic really lends itself to very, solid, flat renditions versus, say, blended and, seamless, illusionistic kinds of representations as well. So once again, not many artists really use acrylic. This is the only example I have for you. However, aside from acrylic, I do want to show a few contemporary approaches to painting and a few of the different kinds of surfaces that we can use. And so this is one of my personal favorite artists. It's a Chinese artist named Zai Xiaowan. But he actually paints on multiple layers of sheet glass to create three-dimensional paintings. And this is one of those things that the first time I saw it, I was like, oh my God, how did he do this? How did he think about doing this? Or, how did he think to do what on which layer of glass to create this 3D effect? And so what he does is he actually paints just a little bit on one layer, then goes to the next, paints a little more and a little more and a little more, back and back and back. And then once they're layered up, it creates this like 3D encapsulated look. But this is all done oil paint on glass. But if we look at another one just from a kind of a side view, we can get a little bit better sense of how it's done. So the first panel might only have just a little bit of paint for the nose, and then as it goes back, it starts to get more and more and more, and then once again gradually recedes off. But depending on how it's displayed and how it's lit, it creates this very interesting effect. Once again, this is something that I really wish I could see how he did it just to see, because it's kind of mind-blowing in my opinion. But aside from things like that, painting on non-traditional surfaces, excuse me, we also have graffiti art, which is probably the more uniquely 21st century painting form. Now, graffiti definitely goes way back into ancient times. If you ever go to Pompeii, the ancient Roman city, you'll see graffiti everywhere, and it's, from ancient times. But in the 21st century, we have guys like Banksy who start to really play up the kind of humorous quality and political commentary within graffiti art, as opposed to just being, gang, signs or name tagging and all that kind of stuff. But I love his work in the graffiti realm because of its humor. So here we have, Vincent Vega and Jules from Pulp Fiction, but their guns have been replaced with bananas and things like that. But I really like a lot of Banksy's work because it plays up this kind of weird juxtapositions and humorous, almost sardonic kinds of juxtapositions. So, here we have a maid sweeping stuff under the rug, but it's, the wall and everything like that. But I also like he does a lot of very political kinds of works. This is one that he does on the Palestine border wall. So he traveled to Palestine and he did all of these murals that were kind of critical of Israel's stance against the Palestinian people. So here we can see the young Palestinian girl kind of frisking the Israeli soldier, and this is something that would be usually in reverse. But what I find interesting is that he's doing this to draw attention to the plight of the Palestinian people. But when he was doing it, an old Palestinian man approached him and said, you're painting the wall, you're making it really beautiful, right? And he's like, yes, thank you. And to which the Palestinian man replies, why? We hate this wall. Like, why are you making it beautiful? And why are you painting on it and everything like that? So it's kind of an interesting take there, but a lot of his stuff promotes these kinds of weird juxtapositions that are atypical to reality and have certain political kinds of messages to them. But once again, I feel like graffiti art in the 21st century has become its own kind of unique painting form as well. But that ends us off for painting. Once again, thanks for joining us. And next time we'll look at more mechanical types of art creation and reproduction. So we'll get into printmaking. So thanks for joining us. We'll see you next time.